It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today, this entire show is going to be about Big Francie, Francis Ngannou, who did amazing things last night. In my opinion, he won. I have watched it a second time. John, I know you watched it a second time and you had it somewhere as a draw, or maybe Tyson Fury won.
It was a joke of a fight. I knew Francis had no shot, so I skipped it. So I imagine he got killed.
Yeah. And then
I'm just kidding. I actually was going to skip it. And then people call me that it's Francis is doing good. And I had to get I don't want to say where I started watching it, but I started watching it and I had to go back and rewatch it because, I was big. I had a big smile on my face after that. But
heck yeah, I think we all did.
Yeah, but I weighing it, watching it, I do give the nod to Fury, but if someone says they thought Francis won, I'm not going to argue because I thought it was that close, which is hilarious. Just to even say that it was that close a match. I thought there was rounds you could flip a coin.
Yes.
So
indeed.
And there were some ugly rounds, but there were some exciting moments too. So
those rounds were so close that I guess some of them were a coin flip. But
I could also imagine judges saying they just in their head, like, there's no way Francis won that round. What I saw must have been an illusion because there's no way that guy did better. And so then give it to Fury.
Yeah, that too. I personally thought he won though. But anyways, first question. I got to know, how much money do you think His Excellency lost on this whole shebang?
Based on the celebrities and the show, all of it. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is broke. They can't pump enough oil to pay for that. That's done. Put a fork in it. No, I don't know. It's they lost a ton. I'm sure they paid a lot for those celebrities. People are not showing up just because they think it's gonna be a great vacation in Saudi Arabia. They're paying Eminem and all those guys a ton of money. So there's a small fortune spent on celebrities and the show and the light. They built that stadium just recently, didn't they?
60 days, but we all know how that stadium got built in 60 days.
Yeah, they have some cost-cutting methods they use that I wouldn't recommend, and I don't approve of. But they still spent a ton. I'm sure that event lost tens, and the purses are outrageous. I mean, I don't think it's as much as people say. Where people were throwing around 50 million for Tyson and 40 some million, 30 or 40 million for Ngannou, and I don't think it was that much for either. But it was tens of millions combined, and overall the event lost probably 10. Even if it sold some, I don't think it did. I don't think the traffic shows that it did gangbusters in the U.S., but I'm sure it sold something. But it didn't. It's not going to sell enough. They lost tens of millions of dollars, but they don't care. It's a big ad to show what they can do in the future.
A while back, we did an episode where we sort of had you go through and kind of figure out, rough estimate, what Francis would have made. Refresh us one more time for those that might not have heard that episode, what you think Francis made off that fight.
Well, they said before Markel and Francis that he would make as much or more than he would make in his entire UFC contract. And if you look at what his UFC contract would have paid for a fight against Jones and a couple fights against, title defenses against not Jones, the total amount paid, I think estimated that it'd actually been higher with pay-per-view and stuff, but the total amount would have been at least 18 million. And that seems to be about the ballpark from other figures I heard. People were throwing around number 10 million, but I think they got that because Fury said 10 million and earlier people said he's going to get 8 figures. So they took the minimum, but my understanding he made more than that, but I don't think he made 20 million or more. So somewhere in the teens of the millions seems like a fair guess.
I remember distinctly the number 18 million floating around.
Yeah, that's because we took the 8 million for the Jones fight, which is what he supposed he was going to get paid 8 million to fight Jones plus pay-per-view. And then against a non-Jones title defenses were going to be 5 to 6 million. So if you take the minimum of that 5 million times by 210 plus Jones 18 million, that's what he would have gotten his UFC contract as a minimum.
What does that loss do for Ngannou?
I mean, it's the definition of victory and loss, because he, even though he would have been a bigger deal if he won, definitely. And in some ways it hurts probably because he is out tens of millions of dollars. He's still going to make a fortune, but tens of millions of dollars on top of what he would have made if he would have beat Fury, because there would have been a demand for a match and you'd have a lot of leverage. And so that's got to hurt. But he is now suddenly, not only is he a major star in combat sports, he is one of the biggest MMA fighters in the world, right? His brand awareness has done nothing but grown since he left the UFC. First with the bidding war for him and the stories. Now his brand awareness is just much bigger than it ever was. And he's now a viable boxing opponent for major boxers for mega bouts, right? He could rematch Fury. He can ask for a lot for that. So there's, he just got a lot of options on both fronts. The guy is standing in the perfect position of what any fighter wants to be. His value is through the roof.
How many people should be eating crow right now besides us?
Well, I don't know. Like, we should be eating crow. We kind of we were pretty, I think, open about walking through what he could do. I remember I wrote an article. We did a whole episode in the past about his options, and we kind of laid out it's a risk, but I think we even said it's worth the risk because the potential upside is so huge for him to leave the UFC. I thought for sure he'd get a decent deal in MMA. He ended up getting a better one than I thought he would, and I thought it'd be enough that would match anything the UFC was offering, and ends up sounding like it was. But we said it was worth it because if he got one of these big blockbuster boxing matches, it would pay off. The risk would be worth it. And he ended up getting the Fury fight, and now he's so I don't know if we should be eating crow. I guess the one crow we could eat is maybe we didn't give him a big enough chance in this fight.
That's what I was going for there. Not that we should be eating crow because we thought he couldn't do any of this stuff and make these deals, because we always thought he could. But what we didn't think was that he could beat Tyson Fury. And that is where I and literally the entire community are eating crow.
Well, I'm going to say, since I never put it on the record, that I picked him to lose barely by 1 round.
Shit, right?
Yeah, I am, but still. This show is a financial show, so we don't have to offer our picks and eat crow for that. Our financial, what we say in the financial aspect of the world sphere is what we have to eat crow about, and that we are right here. But yeah, one thing I think is amazing. You remember everybody was making fun of those open workouts he was doing. Mm-hmm. And he's doing, he's doing, he's out hitting the pads and the mitts and stuff, and people are laughing how bad he looked. He was trolling all of us, obviously. Mm-hmm. Because he looked like a completely different person. So I give him credit for doing that. But on the financial side, there's a lot of people that got to eat crow. Yes. I remember a lot of people saying it's stupid of him to leave the UFC. He's never going to make this kind of money. He's destroying his career. There's no boxing. He has no future in boxing. They were saying all that. There were MMA fighters and MMA managers that were trying to talk him out of fighting out his contract in the UFC, because they were swearing you can't get out of your contract. You're misinterpreting it. You'll never make this kind of money except what the UFC is offering. And I wonder, those people are now looking at themselves wondering, man, maybe I've been following the wrong advice for myself, because Francis here ignored whatever else was saying. And now he is making multiples what anybody else in his position in the UFC would have made.
So what are his options in boxing going forward? Because, we saw, what's his name from WBC, Suleiman, say that he's going to be ranked Monday morning in the top 10.
And probably rightfully so, based on that performance.
Yeah, probably. Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what their guideline rules are supposed to say. I'd have to go through it again, but they seem to ignore their own guidelines a lot. So, he's got a lot of options, because you put on this performance, he needs basically one win to build up his name value again, to get a rematch, or to fight Usyk if Usyk beats Fury, right? There's big fights that will sell a lot, that will pay him a lot of money, like against Wilder, against Joshua. Those are out there. And then there's even second tier boxers. I mean, he could fight a Derek Chisora.
Andy Ruiz.
Andy Ruiz, although if I'm him, I think I stay away from Andy Ruiz.
But that's a second tier boxer that brings in millions.
It does, but he doesn't bring as much as Wilder and Joshua, but he also, he's not a monster, so you can't sell the monster aspect, but he's quick. He's really quick.
Mm-hmm. And he's gotten in shape.
Yeah, he's fast for a heavyweight. I don't know if that's the type of. I mean, I'd have to see Ngannou fight a few more times, but I think that's the right decision for him to take a guy like Ruiz. But put him against Joshua and Wilder, and that sells just like hotcakes.
Mm-hmm. Is he going to be as big as Conor? Are we going to see some proper 12 Francis Ngannou type stuff? Are we going to see, a forged stout for Francis Ngannou? What can he do outside of the ring and outside of the cage?
Well, I don't see him doing that kind of stuff. I don't see him as being as big as Conor like that, because I don't see him having that lifestyle impact where Conor had an image that every Yahoo that thought he was Irish would go out and pretend, so, but I do see him being a big deal, and he might have, especially like in Africa and certain parts of the world, he might have massive endorsement possibilities there. Now, Africa is not, as a continent, most of the countries there do not have much money, but it's a vast billion people plus, so it's a huge market. So there's a possibility there. I just don't see that Conor McGregor type, but I think the door is open now for a lot of sponsorship possibility. And what's interesting too is because of his, because he fought in the UFC and he's a known commodity from the UFC, even though in hindsight, consider how big he is, the UFC did not do the job promoting him they probably should have done. But because he has that, he's also a known commodity in America. And so he has, he's known in America, he's known in France, and he's known in Africa, and probably will be known in Middle East, North Africa, thanks to the Saudi connection. So he has a good chance just to rake in a lot of sponsorship opportunities that were probably not available to before.
How about a book? I think his story is so interesting. I think they should write a book on him.
His story is insane. It doesn't even sound real.
Right?
A documentary they could do, a movie. I mean, the one thing is, I don't know, as interesting people's stories are, and sometimes the most amazing stories, it's like, how do you cast someone to play him?
Right.
Yeah. Is he going to play himself? Because no one looks like the guy's a monster, right? He's just a chiseled, just a perfect human being. You got that. That's the hardest part to find, is someone to play him. So the story, it might be years down the future, but his story is absolutely amazing. I don't know how you cash it, but I would love to, I would read a book. I mean, when he talks about it in interviews, it's fascinating. He has probably the most amazing story in MMA.
Yeah, I would agree. Definitely. So was that fight bad for boxing? Was it good for MMA? Was it bad for MMA? What was that fight? Put it in perspective.
Well, a lot of boxing fans are nervous and do now think it's bad because their heavyweight champion almost lost to an MMA fighter in his first boxing match. And a lot of fans were watching and were upset because they thought Ngannou won. And so you put all that together, and a lot of people think this was bad for boxing. I don't think it was bad for boxing, though, because for the simple fact is Ngannou's not leaving boxing, right? It'd be one thing if he came in, had this fight as like a UFC fighter, and then was leaving to go back to the UFC, and then UFC fans could boast about it and rub it in all the time, right? But one thing is Dana White burned the bridges with them, right? They left on bad terms, so the UFC can't embrace Ngannou's performance. That's one. So they can't get taunted by the UFC fans to boxing. The other thing is Ngannou's going to stick in boxer. He is now a boxer. So boxing gains. They gain a new attraction in boxing, right? And they gain some potential big fights. So, and Ngannou, because of the MMA background, is going to bring fans in that probably don't normally tune in to boxing matches. The boxing MMA fans obviously will, but there are, only 10% of MMA fans or boxing fans cross over. So that's a very large audience in MMA that you can now bring into boxing. Get them to maybe like the sport more or whatever. And so I think it's a positive for boxing.
What about MMA?
MMA, I don't think it's bad because it's good in the sense that MMA fighter did well, but it's not as good as it would be if he was coming back to MMA right away. And, MMA could kind of like use that to like, oh, look how better MMA fighters are. Because for all practical purposes, it looks like Ngannou going forward, even though he says he still wants to fight MMA, going forward, it looks like he's going to be a boxer more than an MMA fighter.
I got a question for you. Mookie said something to me last night. He said that if the UFC hadn't been so bullheaded, that maybe they could have worked out something with Francis. But basically, this all comes down to the fact that if they just let him box, if they'd let him have his boxing matches, if they'd said yes, they could have made a small fortune here, because maybe it wouldn't have been held in Riyadh. Maybe the UFC could have co-promoted with Queensberry or with Top Rank, ESPN, etc., etc. Could that have happened, and would they have made a tidy fortune the same way they did with Conor when he fought Floyd?
Well, I don't think they would have made anywhere like they made with Conor for that fight, because it wouldn't have done the number. It didn't do close to the numbers. But I mean, the one thing is they didn't know, and I'm sure everybody assumed that Ngannou was going to get killed, and they didn't want Ngannou going in there getting killed and tarnishing their brand, right? Mm. So I think that's one. But let's say they did accept it. Yeah, they lost out. Maybe not on a fortune on this one the one fight, because it wouldn't have been as big. But they lost out on keeping Ngannou, putting him in this boxing match, and now they could have kept him on a smaller contract. If they would have agreed to the boxing terms much earlier, he wouldn't have got paid as much in MMA. He would have taken a smaller contract. He would have accepted it. So they'd have, Ngannou going over to box, probably would have fought Jon Jones already. But let's say he beat Jones, or actually might have maybe delayed the Jones fight to go box. But let's say he delays the Jones fight to go box. He does this performance against Fury. The UFC brand, the Zuffa brand, would have been everywhere, right? So they would be hyping their product everywhere. They would get a percentage of what Ngannou was making. That probably been part of the deal, that they get a percentage of sizable, so they would have made some money on it. But on top of that, now you have this superstar Ngannou that did this performance, and you can bring him back to the UFC and put him against Jon Jones. They would have made a fortune on the next fights of Ngannou. And now they've lost out on having the contractual rights to him in the future at a price they set.
Now, Ngannou has said that he still wants to figure out a way to fight Jon Jones. Is there a way this can happen?
I don't think so, because, I mean, I guess the one thing, would the UFC agree to Ngannou's terms? They'd have to co-promote with PFL. That's never going to happen, right? They will never co-promote. So that knocks that off. So the next step would be, will Ngannou somehow get out of his PFL contract in a reasonable time? And then with the UFC, because he's going to want something akin to what he's making in boxing, right? To fight Ngannou, that might be too much for the UFC to give him, because they don't want to break their model. The other step would be for Jon Jones to get out of his contract. The problem is he just re-signed. Now, my understanding is he probably had a sunset clause. He could have waited a year till next year, been out of that UFC contract, and then fought Ngannou.
Right.
Now, that fight, everybody I've talked to in the industry, everybody says that fight is huge. It'd be huge even outside the UFC, because just the interest level in it. In many ways, Jon Jones has got to be, if you talk about someone fumbled the bag, it might be Jon Jones, because if that fight sells as much as people think, like 1.5 million buys, 1.6, just a huge number of buys that people think it would do, like one of the biggest MMA fights, perhaps the biggest ever. He would have not only doubled what he's making with the UFC, but quadrupled what they're paying him. And so he lost out on a generational wealth match, and possibly a rematch if they wanted to do it again. And so if anybody fumbled the bag, it might have been Jon Jones, because he no longer has that kind of fight available to him.
If you were to calculate, like really sit down and put your mind to the numbers, give me a rough estimate of how much money the UFC lost out on not signing him and not doing all of those things that you said.
Well, I mean, the only big assumption we're going to make the assumption that Jon Jones and Francis Ngannou would have fought after this Fury fight. That's the only fight, let's say, that they're going to make, the UFC is really going to make money on. But they're going to have them signed to the contracts they have now. So both of them, well, the people I've talked to, they were projecting, apparently, I don't know if this is true, but the UFC apparently was projecting that they would have made like over 1 million to 1.5 million pay-per-view buys. Now they might be, a lot of other people in the industry think it's a 1.8 million pay-per-view buy, maybe more, maybe as much as Khabib, which is over 2 million. So a massive event. So you got this massive event that's going to make $100 million in pay-per-view revenue for the promotion, except we got a caveat there, because the UFC doesn't make that much anymore. that money, now the ESPN has a set deal, so ESPN would be super happy with that, but the UFC would not get all that pay-per-view money anymore. They'd get a bigger piece, but they have a guarantee and then an upside, but nothing like they would in the past. But there'd be $100 million in normally promotional revenue, and the gate would probably be like 30, the biggest gate in UFC history. Because if you look at what the UFC 295 tickets were priced at, I think that would sell out with those two, so 30 million. So the UFC, they might not get the money directly, but with the TV deal and stuff, and then you pay the two of them 30 million combined, probably is it, based on the contracts they were getting. You're talking UFC left just for the fight on the table, $100 million they would have made, and above and beyond all costs. So $100 million EBITDA or profit for that fight.
Plus a cut.
And then who knows if they do it again, might be another 100 million.
Golly, it's just insane. The UFC brought up Ngannou as part of their request to reopen discovery in the antitrust case. Does Francis help the UFC make the case that they're not a monopsony?
Well, that's what the UFC claims. In that they want to reopen discovery and amend the schedule too, but they filed a motion to go look at what happened post and if you follow us, the antitrust lawsuit case, Lee versus Zuffa, goes from 2010 to 2017. They want to open discovery and look at what's happened from 2017 till now. And they claim, and I'm just going to read the portion that they talk about Ngannou. And in moving from UFC to PFL, former UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou announced that PFL offered him greater compensation than UFC. If plaintiff's allegation in this case and Johnson regarding allegedly exclusionary contracts were correct, UFC fighters would not be signing contracts with competitors. That's their argument. The Johnson then refers to the second antitrust case, Johnson v. Zuffa. So their argument is if the UFC had this exclusionary contracts and were a monopsony, UFC fighters couldn't go sign contracts with the competitors. Now, they make a pretty good argument here, except for the fact if you pay really close attention to MMA, if you listen to our show, you know that the only reason Francis Ngannou, right, could leave to go fight Fury is because in 2017, up until more recently, they put in a sunset clause, right, as an answer to the antitrust lawsuit. That sunset clause didn't exist before 2017. So they made this change so you couldn't make the argument that their contracts were forever. Francis Ngannou took advantage of it, and now they've changed the contracts. Now they still have a sunset clause, the most recent contract I saw, but it is a terrible sunset clause. In fact, it says if you hold out with the purpose of not accepting fights, the sunset clause, they can keep extending it beyond the 5 years. So it ruins the whole purpose of a sunset clause, right? So they got rid of that. So their argument is, Francis Ngannou is an example of how we didn't have monopsony power. And you're like, well, yes, but that would only apply to the brief period that you change your contracts so they no longer perpetual. And so that's only a couple-year window, which no longer applies because everybody's on under the new contracts. The other thing is, if Francis Ngannou demonstrates that you can go outside the UFC and make tens of millions of dollars in a fight not promoted by the UFC for these fighters, and that potentially another MMA fighter could fight him and make tens of millions of dollars, because his PFL deal is supposedly structured like a boxing deal. He gets a minimum, like $8 to $10 million minimum, is everything I've heard. But if it sells huge amount of pay-per-views, he gets what Canelo gets, what Gervonta Davis, a huge cut of the pay-per-view. So $1 million selling pay-per-view, he could end up making $30 million. Ngannou could, right? Well, his opponent, Jon Jones, could get the same deal or some other one. But why not then do those fighters take advantage of that? Why wouldn't a fighter choose to go fight Ngannou outside the UFC? And to me, I'm sure the plaintiffs, maybe they won't, but if I was the plaintiffs, I would point that out, because the only explanation is the UFC has monopsony power and fighters can't exit the UFC to take advantage of these large purses that are available to them.
The UFC is that driver that gets pulled over and they don't have insurance. So they go buy insurance and show up in court and say, but I have insurance, look.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of this, it just strikes me as an attempt that if the appeal process fails, if they're not picked up or the appeal isn't picked up by the Ninth Circuit, they're trying to delay the case even longer.
Yeah.
And that's what it strikes me as, because it was not, I thought it was well written, but if you follow the business, if you follow MMA, the arguments they make don't quite line up with the reality of what the state of the industry is like.
All right, final question. Does this breathe new life into MMA fighters crossing over into boxing?
Unfortunately, yes. I think we saw Tank Davis make a comment to Sean O'Malley. I know Canelo has made some comments about in recent weeks about Conor McGregor in the future. The problem is, because Ngannou did so good, I think a lot of fans now expect that they're going to give fighters a chance again against boxers. And for the boxers, it's great because they still look at it as like, oh, this fight can generate a lot of money. And these opponents are much easier than the guy. I mean, Canelo says right now he wants to focus on his career and, on the top guys, wait till when on his downward side. But if I'm a guy like Canelo, would you either fight David Benavidez or McGregor? Right. Mm-hmm. I think the choice is obvious, especially if the McGregor fight brings in more money. So that's on that side. And the other problem is for the MMA fighters, they look at what Francis did. They think they can do it. They also look at how much money he's going to be making in boxing, how much more it is in MMA. And they view that as the avenue to make more money, that if I can go box, I will make more money. Now, I don't know why it doesn't hit them that there's no reason MMA can't pay as much as boxing. The only reason is that the promoter keeps all the money. But they don't want to tackle that. Their idea is, if I can somehow go box, I'll make that kind of money. But you're still stuck with the problem is you have the same promoter. Is that promoter going to let you make that kind of money, or are they going to take the majority of it?
So much stuff to unpack from one single fighter. Can you believe that Francis Ngannou created all this?
But we got to blame him for all this. He just created chaos, anarchy. He's bringing the whole industry down.
I love that for him, though.
I do too.
Okay, I do have one more question. Go back. Tell me what this does for PFL.
Well, for PFL is in a strange position because they actually benefit a lot because they signed Ngannou with spending very little on him. They spent some advertising, marketing budget, whatever little they had to spend on him. They've gotten a huge amount increase in the profile. Ngannou's profile has done nothing but grow since they signed him. He's a bigger star now, much, much bigger than when they signed him. So they have benefited immensely that they have signed this heavyweight that might be one of the biggest stars in MMA in the world. The bad part for PFL is they have him under contract and they'd like to have him fight, but they don't have an opponent. And without an opponent, how do you get him to go into MMA? Now they could pay him his minimum, but his minimum now, what they have as minimum, like 8 to 10 million, that's going to be well below what he's going to earn in boxing now against the top boxers. And they do not have a fighter, an MMA fighter that they can put against him that will generate the kind of revenue that can match what he would make in boxing. So he might not go back to MMA at all. They might have this guy that they can brag about having Ngannou and one of the biggest stars in the world, but they can't get him an opponent and they can't pay him enough to fight MMA. So he might never appear in the smart cage, which is the big negative, because without the revenue he would generate that they can show investors, there's no way they can really grow that company and keep everybody happy. The one thing I think is possible, though, if they do hold an event in Africa, I do think it's very plausible that Ngannou would do it for that minimum purse, just for the ability to fight in Africa. But that's the one exception. I don't know if it's in their business plan to actually have an event with him in Africa, but I could see that happening. But beyond that, they don't have all the fighters in MMA that would make sense, that would generate tons of revenue, are all signed to the UFC. And the only possibility is, can they convince a boxer? Can they convince Deontay Wilder to do what he talked about doing and cross over and do an MMA fight? That might work. But beyond that, I can't see an opponent that would generate the money that would get Ngannou to actually enter the cage.
Deontay Wilder coming over to MMA. Ooh, my goodness. I don't think I want to see that, but I would love to see Francis go and box Deontay.
The one outside the box one that would actually sell like hotcakes would be a massive hit. Ngannou versus one of the Paul brothers.
Oh, of course. Yes. Logan. It would need to be Logan, though, wouldn't it?
I don't see how they would accept it, because they would legitimately risk their health and life for that. But, someone said, if you're throwing tens of millions at them,
yeah,
who knows? They might be go crazy enough. Like, I'm willing to do it, but I maybe let them box both of them or fight both of them in one night.
Oof, insane. All right, so that's going to wrap us up. John, what do you got coming up?
Well, I've got this podcast, obviously, the Hey Not the Face podcast. I've got a couple articles I've been working on. I'm a little behind on them because my normal job's taking so much time. But coming on the next week or two, I'll have a couple articles on Bloody Elbow. One about my attempt to fix boxing. I've noticed a lot of major boxing stars complaining about the sport, and it's based on some stuff we've actually talked about in previous podcasts. I'll also have updated some financial information about the UFC that's going to come out by the end of the month. And beyond that, I also will be appearing on the Alexi Old's If the Shoe Fits podcast Tuesday nights.
All righty. Well, there you have it, folks. Today's episode, Francis Ngannou special. Y'all know the drill. Until next time, please stay safe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!